Hi, this is Shelby Adams, and I'm going to be reading my covenant reflection for the class Pentateuch. Okay? A covenant in the simplest form is described as a solemn promise to engage in or refrain from a specific action. That's according to the covenant law. However, a biblical covenant is so much more. Although in nature it's still the same idea of basically a promise to do one thing or another, it means so much more to the people involved or for those who are following years after. A biblical covenant was a look into the kind of God we serve. It showed that He was not a God who would stand at a distance and watch our lives go by. Rather, He is a God who is actively involved and cares about every aspect of our lives. He is a God who cares for His people and prepares a bright future for us. A biblical covenant is a way for God to prove His faithfulness to His people. Although He is a great God who need not do miraculous things to prove Himself to us, He chooses to anyway. He does not want to be a God who stands by hoping that His people will come to know Him and trust Him, but a God who actively pursues each of us. Just as a husband is to continually pursue his wife in all of his days, so God chooses to seek after us and gain our trust. While God could simply command us to trust Him and force us to love Him, He instead makes the choice to earn our trust, to prove that He is one we can rely on. By making huge promises that seem impossible and yet seeing them through to completion, He gains people's trust. Take Abraham, for example. He and his wife Sarah had been unable to have a child for many years of trying. They had prayed and prayed for God to bless them with offspring so that their family would not die off when they were gone. God's response to Abraham's plea is far greater than anything he could have imagined. God said, "Go outside and look up at the heavens and count the stars. If indeed you can count them, so shall your offspring be." Genesis 15:5. God promises to go above and beyond Abraham's request for an heir. He promises to make his descendants so numerous that he cannot even count them. Where most of us would have doubted, saying, "I'm too old," or "That's impossible," Abraham trusted God and believed that He promised would come true. It is estimated that Sarah was 91 years old and Abraham 100 when they had their first child. This fact in itself is amazing. In today's world, if you have a child over 35, you are seen to be too old to be a mother. The risk of pregnancy complications is far too great to even consider. But God does the impossible. He blesses Abraham and Sarah with a healthy baby boy, even in their old age. God proved to Abraham and his family that God would remain faithful even when the situation seemed impossible. I believe this covenant was made with Abraham to show he and his descendants that God is a God of never-ending possibilities, and that trusting in Him is the best way to have a fulfilling life. Abraham could have thrown in the towel on his 90th birthday and accepted that God wasn't going to come through. Instead, as his wrinkles grew deeper and his age increased rapidly, he remained hopeful in God's promise that He would come through. Because of Abraham and Sarah's faith in God, we, as their descendants, can forever look to the covenant that was made as God's sign of faithfulness. We can look upon their situation in our hardest times when we want to give up and say that God is not going to come through. While a child at 91 is a bit unheard of in our modern day, we can still apply this covenant in many other ways. We can use it as an example of God's perfect timing as well. Sure, Abraham might have preferred to have a son when he was a newlywed and had many years of youth to enjoy with his child, but God had a greater plan. Because they waited so long for God's answer, their faith grew larger and larger. In order to keep believing that they would have a child, they had to develop more trust in God each day. While they could have doubted more and more each day without a child, they instead chose to praise God and trusting faith that He would come through for them. We can take their faith as an example of our own. God's timing is so much better than ours. We may believe we are ready for something long before God does, but in the time of waiting, God is perfecting us. He is molding and shaping us into the best version of ourselves that we can possibly be. The same covenant was also made to build relationship with Abraham, and in turn, us as well. By making Abraham wait for many years for the child he was promised, it allowed Abraham to spend lots of quality time with God. While he was begging for a child, he was bonding with God, building a firm relationship that could not have been developed any other way. The same proves true for his wife Sarah. Sarah was also praying continually for their precious baby that they were promised, and because of this was drawing nearer to her father each day. We can take from this the same thing. We may be waiting patiently for something we feel God has promised us and growing impatient because of the time it is taking to get here. Whether you have prayed for your whole life for a husband to make your own, for a job that you have always dreamed of, or for an illness to be healed, maybe the time of waiting is the most important part. Maybe God is allowing you this extra time with Him just so that you can have a firm foundation of faith before His blessing arrives. Maybe He wants your personal faith to be strong in its foundation before complicating it with a spouse to be faithful with as well. Maybe He is helping you grow in your faith more before starting your new job so that you'll be better prepared to witness to your future coworkers. Maybe He is waiting to heal the illness so that you will continue to rely on Him and never again take your good health for granted. Whatever the reason, we must begin to see our many barren years as a blessing as well. God uses His covenants and promises to build relationships with us. The same was true for the Noahic covenant. After bringing Noah and his family safely through the flood, God promises to never destroy mankind again by a flood. I establish my covenant with you, that never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of the flood, and never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. Genesis 9:11. Through the 40 days and nights on the ark, God was building a relationship with Noah. He was instilling hope in them, showing them that He was grateful for their faithfulness when all of the rest of the world went wayward. God was growing their faith in ways that they could have never imagined. They were chosen out of all the people on earth to be who God chooses to repopulate the earth. What a humongous task for them. God was showing them that even in the hardest of times, He will prove to be faithful. Noah was probably a lot like Evan Baxter in the movie Evan Almighty. People probably thought he was crazy for building a giant boat when there was not yet rain. They probably laughed at him for saying that he was in direct communication with God, but he held strong and trusted that God's plan was best. From the outside of this story, we can see that God has proven faithful yet again. We are here, 2,000 years later, and as wicked as the world has become, God has still not yet destroyed us by flood. While I do believe that eventually the earth will be destroyed, I know that God will be faithful in His covenant and it will not be demolished by water again. In addition to this, the Noahic covenant also shows that God's timing is perfect. 40 days and nights on an ark with no land has probably seemed like an eternity. But as mentioned earlier, maybe this was the amount of time God needed to perfect Noah and his family, so that they can have a strong foundation to base the new world on. God uses His covenants for many other reasons as well. I believe another big reason God makes covenants with His people is to show that He cares for our future. God has more than just His life for us, for He has planted eternity in the human heart. But even so, people cannot see the whole scope of God's plan from beginning to end. Ecclesiastes 3:11. We cannot physically comprehend what God has planned for us, but this is where His covenants can bring us comfort. None of His covenants say that they will be fulfilled in the next 10 minutes, or promise to come true before nightfall. Instead, they all take time. They are all set in the future, are all a promise that you will have a future. The perfect example of this is found in 2 Samuel 7:8-16, when God tells David, a sheep herder, the great plans that He has for him. He plans for him to slay a giant, become a king, and lead a nation, but all that David knows is that he needs to trust God, because He has great things in store for him. God cares so deeply for us, and He wants us to be confident about our futures. Not only our futures here on earth, although He promises to give us hope and a future in Jeremiah 29:11, but also our future in eternity. Our hearts are designed to never fully be home here on earth. We will always feel like a little part of us is missing when we are here on earth, because He has set eternity in our hearts. We are made for so much more than this world, and His covenants are a way of reminding us that the best is yet to come. So that's the end of my paper, and I just wanted to say thank you for such an awesome course. I have enjoyed learning about the Pentateuch and developing a greater understanding of what His covenants really mean to us and to the people that were involved. So thank you so much, and I've really enjoyed your class.